welcome to this seminar on English politics and values. I'm Jon Denham and I'm the director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics at Southampton University. Welcome to the seminar. We've got some great speakers today. Just a couple of the usual housekeeping things. Please do use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves while the seminar is going on and to pursue side discussions. Please use the Q&A button if you want to ask a question, and there is a function there where you can upvote or like other people's questions, which will help me later on deciding which issues to prioritize. Got some great speakers who I'll introduce in just a moment. Just to give people the background to this seminar, we're really discussing today a group of voters who we can reasonably say have reshaped the politics of England and of the United Kingdom and arguably of Europe too over the last 20 years. Without them, Boris Johnson wouldn't be going to Brussels today. They're a group of voters who are predominantly from working class backgrounds. 20 years ago, whether they voted or not, they would have described themselves probably as Labour or coming from Labour families or Labour communities. As the 2000s went on, they allied themselves increasingly with an older strand of conservative Euroscepticism to vote for UKIP in such numbers that David Cameron ultimately felt forced to offer a European referendum in his manifesto in 2015. There's an arguable case that some of these voters at least helped give David Cameron his majority because they didn't like the idea of SNP MPs telling a minority Labour government what to do. And certainly they were the decisive voters in England's Brexit vote in 2016 and again in the election of Boris Johnson last December. So that's the group of voters in very broad terms that we're talking about today, and hopefully not introduce too many stereotypes. I, of course, because I happen to be a professorial fellow on English identity and politics, tend to focus on the fact that these voters, if asked, tend to identify themselves as more English than British. But that's not actually the focus of today's discussion as such. That's part of the background that we can park, because I certainly have the view, as many of you will do on this webinar, that anybody who comes along and says, I have got the one single explanation that explains why people do what they do is almost certainly wrong. And we'll only get a rounded view of this part of the electorate if we take a number of different perspectives. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this seminar. Paula Surridge from Bristol University has written extensively on values and how they influence political behaviour. Simon Winlow has written about the relationship between the Labour Party and working class voters and is co-author of a study of the rise of the English Defence League. Jon Lawrence from Exeter has revisited some of the great sociological studies of working class communities over the last 60 or 70 years to look at what they tell us about identity and community, belonging and autonomy. And David Lammy will certainly need no introduction, very prominent campaigning Labour MP, now Shadow Justice Secretary. So they will be our speakers. I've asked people to aim for 8 minutes each, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So we'll start, please, with Paula. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I'm just going to take 1 minute to share my slides with you all and hope this works first time. There we go. Hope you can all see that. So as John said, my main interest in this is in the relationship between core political values and political behaviour. And the introduction John just gave there talked about this group of voters that have been discussed extensively over the last few years, but quite often in very binary terms. So the left behind, the white working class, the somewheres and so on, always set up in opposition to another group. And one of the things I want to argue and have argued elsewhere is that that's an oversimplified view of the groups of voters within the electorate, and that we need to understand them as groups that are multidimensional in character and move beyond binaries to look at how English politics, but politics across the whole of the UK and indeed Europe has been fragmenting over time rather than polarizing. Right, now I've just got to work out how to make the slides move along. There we go. So just very briefly, because John said 8 minutes, and it didn't mean 8 minutes per slide, I don't think. This is how I am conceiving of values. I'm not going to go through all the items. These are fairly standard now measures of core political values, which have appeared on surveys going back to the late 1980s. So they don't tap into particularly issues of the day. They're designed to be more enduring than that. They don't tap into moral issues, and they don't have anything directly about welfare, which I think is potentially an element that's missing. I use these two value scales to think of the electorate as being broken up into groups. Now, I don't want to say these are hard boundaries in the same way that when we come to talk about class later on, the boundaries around a particular class are a little bit fluid, although we can identify a class group. I think the same is true of values groups. And what I do with these values groups to try and understand this is to break each of these dimensions into 3 parts. So on the left, I've got a left, a centre and a right group. And on the liberal authoritarian scale, I've got a liberal, moderate and authoritarian group. Not always overly happy with the labels, and I'm sure that's something someone will want to challenge later on. For information, this is how the English electorate were distributed across those groups based on data from the 2019 British Election Study Internet Panel. So the weight of voters in England is to the left, but within each group, the weighting is also towards the moderate or authoritarian end of the liberal authoritarian dimension. And critically, for understanding the voters that we're going to be talking about in this session, many of them are in the left-leaning but not liberal groups. And these are actually some of the largest groups in the electorate, which helps to explain why they've been so influential, because actually as a group, they make up a significant chunk of the electorate. Now, what I thought would be useful for the purposes of this seminar was to look a little bit at the social characteristics of these groups of these values groups. And again, mindful of the fact I didn't have very much time, so there's a lot of information on some of these slides. But what we've got here are for each of these values groups, the proportion of that group who are either in a working class occupation, defined by the semi-routine and routine groups of the NSSEC, or and in the second chart have a degree or higher level qualification. So you can see that there are 2 things that stand out about this group of left-leaning but more authoritarian voters. Firstly, they are more likely to be from working class occupations than other groups, although they are by no means dominated by working class voters. And they are also much less likely to have a degree or higher level of education than the other groups of voters on the left. So that, if you like, is a very quick look at their objective social characteristics. We can also look in the same way at the identity of those groups. So here I've looked at their national identity measured through Englishness and whether or not they hold a class identity when asked. So the first chart is the average Englishness on a 1 to 7 scale of each group. And I think it's really useful to note here that there is a relationship here, a pattern, in that the more liberal the voters are, the less English they feel, and vice versa. But there's not much of a relationship here between left and right. So Englishness is an identity that connects with that second social dimension of values rather than with the economic dimension of values. We can also see here that those on the left are much more likely to still claim a working class identity. And amongst those with left-wing economic values, but with less liberal social values, more than half actually still identify as working class. So quite high levels of working class identity among these groups. I'm sure following speakers will pick up on that a little bit, but it's something that we need to further understand and explain how different political actors have been able to activate that working class identity in particular ways. So what does this mean for the actual political behaviour? The chart I'm showing you here focuses only on change between 2017 and 2019. Actually, this process of movement amongst these different groups of voters has been happening for quite a long time. If you go back and look at the 1997 data, you'll see that the Labour were able to win voters across all these different categories in roughly equal amounts in 1997. And then from 2010 onwards, there's been this increased gradient within the voters on the left, whereby Labour's been able to win more of the Liberal voters, fewer of the authoritarian voters, and where Labour has increasingly lost out on the vote in the centre of the economic left-right scale to the Conservatives. You can't see the levels in this chart, unfortunately. But what I wanted to bring out from this chart is two things about the changes between 2017 and 2019. Labour lost the largest share of the votes from those that were on the left authoritarian part of this value dimension. The Conservatives similarly were able to consolidate votes. They gained about 10 percentage points amongst that group between 2017 and 2019. But the story of English voters is more complex than just that group that have variously been identified by the labels John used at the start, because actually the Labour vote share fell across all these groups. There was no group in which there was any kind of compensation for the loss of these left, moderate and authoritarian voters in particular. So that's a problem for the Labour Party in terms of what it can do to win voters back, because actually the vote is fracturing everywhere. And if we focus only on the voters that are the topic of today's seminar, then that might cause frictions and tensions elsewhere. For the Conservatives, they were able to eat into that left-wing authoritarian group, which is quite astonishing, really, when you consider that in the previous slide, I showed you such high levels of working class identification amongst this group, that the Conservatives, led by someone from Eton with the private school background and so on, not in any way an epitome of working classness, that's not a word, but I'm sure you understand what I mean, were able to take votes in this group of voters who themselves identify as being working class. And I think that's something else that we haven't really fully understood. Didn't have time to create another slide with this on it, but one thing that I think has been really overlooked in this story, and I don't have 2019 data for it yet, but that group of voters has also increasingly stayed away from elections as well. So they're now becoming less likely to turn out in elections, as well as switching their votes between Labour and Conservative. So there are two processes going on there in terms of the disconnection of that group of voters from their traditional party positions. I lost track of how I'm doing for time, but I don't think that was too far off the 8 minutes.
That was great, Paula. Thank you very much indeed. And I think that set the scene perfectly with that view of this particular group of voters. And I'm going to move on straight away now. Well, just before I do straight on to Simon, just a reminder to the audience, there are over 100 people out there. Do use the chat function if you want to discuss things amongst yourselves, and please do start putting questions into the Q&A, which will help me later on. So thank you very much, and over to you, Simon.
Hi, nice to meet you all. I'll have no original data or any research to present to you. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is based upon many years of detailed empirical research in neighbourhoods that were once the seabeds of democratic socialism. For the most part, I have been looking at the criminological and sociological effects of deindustrialisation. Of course, I'm sure it will come of no surprise to you that the majority of these effects have been overwhelmingly negative. The philosopher Adrian Johnson's concept of deaptation is useful here in capturing the reality of these populations. The ideologies that once sustained these places, gave meaning and colour to their lives and whatnot, are now increasingly irrelevant. Rather than adapting, these places are deactive. The people have effectively fallen out of history through no fault of their own. And this has inspired a sense of abandonment, a growing sense of irrelevance, and this informs the politics of these places. And I'll be absolutely honest, for me, their feelings of abandonment are entirely justified. They have indeed been forgotten. They have indeed been ignored, certainly throughout the neoliberal period by the organised left in this country. Their worries about future generations, which they talk about at great length, are also entirely justified. I can't see anything particularly positive on the horizon for young people growing up in these red wall constituencies. I think the anger that spilled into the Brexit vote is also justified. If we were in their position, we'd feel angry too. And this is the background against which we see the rise of the EDL and Britain First. But the failure of these men and women who got involved in the EDL and Britain First to identify their true adversary, the true cause of their downward mobility and growing irrelevance, is suggestive of other important changes. And that's really what I want to come on to now. I've spent a huge amount of time investigating the evolution of the political left in this country. And to cut long story short, the left has displayed marked disinterest in political economy, especially since the 1960s. What we've seen is an enculturation of leftist politics, an almost deliberate withdrawal from the field of political economy, and the general faith that all of the key battles to be fought from now into the future will be waged on the field of culture. The left's capitulation to neoliberalism has been devastating. Its acceptance of austerity, its imposition of those austerity measures post the global financial crisis is devastating. But that's not the only issue at stake. The left has failed to construct a compelling story about a better future it hopes to create, a better future that will allow these populations to look to the future with optimism, that jobs will be available, community will be sustained and will become a vital feature of their lives. And all of this stuff, was once core to the political left in this country. The left's themes are clustered around collectivism and universalism. The old discourse of class injustice is the primary example. Rather than holding difference on high, the left's traditional discourse sought to make cultural differences unimportant. When we suffered for the same reasons. When we moved forward as one. The left's present cultural agenda ignores collectivism and universalism, and so inevitably leaves many people feeling left out. For me, it is very strange to see many notable leftists present the bulk of the English working class as being somehow the beneficiaries of historical injustice. And in my empirical research, when I walk the streets and talk to these people, it strikes them as just odd to listen to, whoever might be talking on Channel 4 News or something like that, about the benefits that have accrued for the English working class. They look around them and say nothing but decline. Their neighbourhoods are declining, their job opportunities are declining, and yet here they are being told that they're some kind of historical beneficiaries. It's simply unproductive politically for the left to pursue this course. It needs to return to collectivism. It needs to return to a narrative of togetherness and sameness rather than difference if it is to move forward. And this brings me on to the theme for today, which is working class conservatism. And as we've already heard, what gets called cultural conservatism is a complex mix of tastes, attitudes, and dispositions. It's not conservative in the traditional sense, we use that phrase in politics or whatever. It varies from issue to issue, and of course it merges in very obvious ways with traditional, especially social democratic political economy. For example, attitude surveys will suggest that since the 60s, people generally don't believe that they hold racist attitudes, but many in these red wall constituencies are also keen to restrict immigration. They're keen to take key utilities back into public ownership and things of that nature. And of course, most are patriots. This clashes with the increasingly liberalised left. Some on the left now seem appalled at the history of England. And of course, this isn't a good sell in red wall constituencies. This especially came to the fore after Brexit, where we heard, newspaper columnists saying they were heading for the borders. They wanted nothing more to do with the country. That obviously isn't a good look for the political left if we are serious about being successful in the future. Historically, the left has profited from criticising injustice in England, but it was always offered a critique based upon the assumption that England was worth fighting for, that there was something there that needed to be defended and nurtured back to health. And the critique was always about rescuing something fundamental rather than simply discarding history and move it forward into some undefined future. I think, generally speaking, to wrap it up, we need collective identities. We need a sense of mutual interests, and these things should be at the core of the left. And I just wanted to finish by pointing to the future. You may have become aware that we're now drifting towards a fundamental shift in global political economy. A real historic change is taking place in the background. What's called the Great Reset is now coming into view. At the moment, across the world, the left has been remarkably disinterested in this event and what it could mean for the future. What the Great Reset looks like could be shaped by an informed and economically literate left. Big changes we see now could be driven forwards by the state in the interests of all. But what looks like happening is that the key beneficiaries will be global oligarchs. If you take a look at the recent trends in the wealth of, Elon Musk and people like that, you get a sense of where power lies and what we need to do to challenge those injustices. And the left, of course, is locked in its fragmentary battles around cultural politics. And I think this is counterproductive. And I agree, with lots of people talking today that the key battles will be between these kind of generally socially conservative, economically social democrat groups and cultural liberals. But that battle is prefaced by a failure of the left to tie diverse cultural groups together in a project of collective betterment. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. And a really fascinating different angle on the relationship between voters and political parties to put alongside Paula's slides, looking at how voters have changed and shifted. I'll move on straight on now then to Jon Lawrence to give us a third perspective on the same people.
I'm going to try and share screen. I've had some failures lately, so fingers crossed this works. We've got a backup if it doesn't.
Yes, we have a backup plan.
So me and Zoom have been at war lately. Just a second. Okay, can you try to get the presentation to come? Is the presentation showing? Or
no,
is it...
not at the moment.
No, that's what I feared. Is anything showing?
No, it's a blank screen apart from the icon.
So it's not working at all. What we'll do is...
Sophie, could you have a go at running the slides?
Yes, I can get them shared.
That's great. Actually, I might as well start talking. Save us.
There we go. No, they're up now.
You could put it in presentation mode.
Let me know when to click.
That's great. So if you could move to the second slide. So basically, I'm talking here from material that's from a book I published quite recently called Me, 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 The Search for Community in Post-War England. And that's a very big book. As you can probably see there, it's based on reanalyzing 10 different social studies over, as John was saying, 70 years, lots and lots of testimony. What I've actually done is, I wonder if I've not followed entirely the brief, because I've decided today to focus in on, given that's 130 30,000 words, to focus in on the little bits of that testimony that do speak directly to the themes around Englishness. But I'm looking across the long period of that 70 years to try and bring out what I see as sort of long-term patterns, the things that haven't, are not ephemeral and have not disappeared over that long period. And I'll try and bring out that there are more continuities than one might imagine in that. Okay, if we could have the second slide, please. So one of the things that struck me when I went back to the actual notes that I'd taken and the testimony was that people talked more about Englishness, and they didn't use that phrase, but about being English in the early testimony rather than in the later. And I think the reason for that is not that that discourse has declined, but actually the taboos around talking about ethnicity and race are much, much greater than they were in the 1940s and 50s. So you will see with some of the examples on that slide from Bermondsey in the 1940s, that essentially you find two things. You find a sort of naive racism, but real racism, people shocked just at the idea that a female anthropologist might sit down in a village with a black man. And the sense of the racial other is extraordinary, but it is very naively expressed, as I say, in these things. But also a very powerful sense of Englishness as an identity, which I was surprised to find. I hadn't actually talked about it in the book, but this is one example of a number where it's clear that people are emphasizing that they're English. And it's not just in that sense about whiteness. And in fact, in the Bermondsey case notes, both in the 1940s and again, they went back in the 50s, there was an enormous amount of anti-Irish sentiment at that time. And in fact, in the local idiom of that moment, Irish meant foreigner in the local lingo. So what I would be saying here, what the sort of takeaway message is that the ethno-Englishness that David talks about in his book, the ethnic strand of English nationalism has a long root. It's not just in the last 10, 20 years that it's found expression, but it's finding political expression. I do think that that is an important theme. So third slide, this is from the late 1950s. And really here, I just wanted to sort of bring out a few of the different ways in which people were talking about the loss of empire, which was happening around them, and the changing patterns of immigration, which actually probably wasn't happening around them in Stevenage, but many of the people in Stevenage had just left London. And I would say, I put up here a particularly offensive comment that one of the ex-Londoners made to Samuel's researchers, because I wanted to be clear about how the taboos just weren't there. People felt able to say these things and indeed to record them in ways it disappears. In my later testimony, I don't get any overt racism. But there were a lot of emotional feelings about the loss of empire. And I'm not entirely convinced that although we're talking here 70 years ago, that has entirely disappeared. There is like an undercurrent that is almost like a memory of some of these feelings. But again, the second example from the male fitter, skilled engineering worker, again shows a much more classic economic form of ethnic exclusiveness. The theme is about England again, and again you see the hostility to immigrant Irish labour undermining, he feels, wage rates, but then a more general anti-immigration comment in the second one. So it's there in the early testimony, it disappears in the later. If you put up the next slide, please. In the later testimony, I don't find anything like that. And there are just a few exceptions, and I'm going to show them to you to get a sense of what they're about. And I think it was because in the 1960s, it was called racialism. We obviously call it racism. It did become something that people became aware of, and it creates a much greater self-consciousness when people are talking to outsiders. But in the examples I give you there, you should be able to see that there's the Enoch Powell argument where working class people are very divided. It should be stressed there. They take both sides in the argument about Powell and indeed about immigration. And somebody who was backing an overt racist comes in with this argument about the fact that although he's actually bending towards the racist shipbuilding worker, but then he says, but actually if they work for a year, before drawing the national assistance, then I don't mind that. The second example from the 1990s is someone who actually does that apologetic thing. I suppose I'm being a bit racist, and then seeks to contrast the experience of older white people with welfare and foreigners. So there's definitely a racial dimension. But again, what you see in both of these is a dominant contractual argument. The idea that welfare is something that is part of almost an individual contract that people have made. And I talk about it in the book as the sort of deep roots of the original national insurance scheme that they put down in our social system, which are much stronger than belief in welfare. So belief in a contractual model of welfare where you pay in and you get out, in her case, and it's not uncommon, linked also to ideas about contributions to the nation, as in reference there to the war. That is how a lot of people think. So the final slide, as I say, in the later stuff, I don't find much explicitly about ethnicity, and nonetheless, what I think is going on is that the taboos are around the ethnic type of English nationalism that David talks about in his book. And what they're also speaking to is the absence of a non-ethnic sort of vehicle for expressing English feelings. That the great institutions of the state are undoubtedly British Parliament, the BBC, rather than English. The FA, I've mentioned, you could also say the English National Opera. There are a few national organisations that are English, there aren't many. And so it's civic nationalism, which is what dominates, say, the politics of the SNP, is something that gets expressed in the English case through the belonging at the local level. And where I live at the moment in Devon, a lot of that is about county loyalties. But I'm from, as I was saying before we started, to Paula, from Bristol. And in Bristol, it's very much a civic patriotism of the city rather than anything broader. And those are incredibly intense, deeply rooted historical constructions. A lot of them are rooted actually in the experiences of the late 19th and early 20th century, the making of new industrial communities. And when we're trying to understand the profound loss that we have, and I agreed with what Paula said about this, given these sort of shorthand homogenizing phrases like the left behind, what we're looking at is something really profound that was constructed in that period, and itself needs its own history of the late 19th, early 20th century, of a powerful pride in place. And it's not just the taking away, therefore, of the jobs or even of the industries, but the destruction of a sense of pride in place. That is so powerful. And I do think that if you're trying to work through this fundamental political problem that we have, that English national feeling doesn't have an obvious vehicle of expression and can easily be pulled into these ethnic rather than civic dimensions, then the answer lies in the politics of place, and it lies in building up a sense of pride in place and locality from the bottom. And the last thing I'd say about this is that one of the things that the book shows is that across the board, the vast majority of people, whether they are born and bred in a place or mobile, feel that sense of connection to place and want somehow to be invested in communities just as much as they want to be invested in family and the personal autonomy that is part of how they understand the post-war world. So that's where I'll end. Sorry about the Zoom chaos.
John, thank you very much indeed. And that adds another layer to understanding about ideas of Englishness now and in the past, and people's relationship to place as well as to the nation. So I turn to our final speaker, David Lammy. Welcome, David. David's the author of Tribes, which is about politics and identity, which John has just talked about. David, over to you.
Well, look, thank you very much. And John, what I want to do is just offer some reflections on some of what I've heard, and in a sense to pick up on some of the themes that I covered in my book. I am not seeking to speak, if you like, in some sort of manifesto terms for the Labour Party. because that would be, I think, going beyond my brief. I suppose my starting point is obviously to want to associate myself very much with what John touched on, and to sort of be pretty upfront, which is what I try to do with in my book, about why I come to things in the way I do, and that is to say, I'm very unapologetic about coming from Tottenham and North London, and being the child of immigrant parents from the Caribbean, the Windrush generation, and all that brings in terms of a powerful sense of Britishness, and a powerful sense in my own parents of coming to the mother country, but also a powerful sense of some of the problems that they came into, and certainly their children came into in Britain, that were very present in the 1970s and 80s and are well documented in things like Scarman and things like Macpherson. But also in my own sense, I've always been very clear, I'm not sure I would be a member of Parliament were it not for my long 7 years in the city of Peterborough. And it's in Peterborough really that I find a lot of the things that I have drawn on, particularly in those early years as an MP, that enables me to sort of think very much about the country, as well as just about my own constituency. And I spent a lot of time in Peterborough in order for me to listen, to hear, to reflect on some of the things that I was picking up, obviously during the vexed Brexit debate, and the powerful sense of belonging, but also the powerful way in which loads of communities have left Labour behind. I've also been struck because I don't, when I'm campaigning, I'm all over the country. I'm not just in Tottenham by any means. That there has been this sense, which I would certainly agree with, which is the premise really for this occasion, that somehow devolution has delivered for Scotland. There's a continued debate that continues, of course, in terms of nationalism, but it's delivered for Scotland in terms of identity, and a continued debate about identity. That is replicated in Wales. Peculiarly, Brexit's raised significant issues in relation to the island of Ireland and Northern Ireland. But somehow, really, when we think of feelings of ill at ease, they are very much in England. And it's the English bit that we talk less about as a country, and certainly my party seems to have less to say about. And I've been really conscious of that. I'm conscious of that because I'm so conscious of my heritage and what makes me me, that I can see that this is a really significant issue. And when you look at the map of where Labour has been pushed back to, and obviously it's a strange business to be in Parliament with just 200 colleagues, to be reduced to the numbers we were reduced to in the last election, you can see very clearly that it's not just about the red wall, which I think is an unfortunate phrase in many ways. And even if we were to get those seats back, and I happen to be of the view that what I found in those seats is the number one thing that came up in the last general election was Jeremy Corbyn. It's being pushed out of whole swathes of the south, southeast, southwest, and those Newtown seats that suburban Britain really, where we're not present in any significant way. So clearly, the ill at ease with us is a much bigger picture of England than it has been before. And in fact, you can see it in Parliament. Many of my colleagues are Welsh. I've got one or two colleagues that are Scottish, and the rest of us really represent city areas of the country. At the same time, there are some truths, aren't there? The north-south divide, I think, in Britain is the biggest it's been since 1911. There are profound changes in the economic structure of the country that exacerbates this. And this is a heavily centralized country at a time where words like devolution sort of go over people's heads and don't seem to mean anything. Yet we have to be in the business of talking about place and home. So my book stressed belonging and proposed ideas like a national civic service. That wasn't a sort of whole of the story, but it's a part of the story. It's getting into having an account of the whole country. And I think that one of the things that cuts across this is it clearly, the debate since the referendum has exacerbated something that I think was quite unusual in politics, which is that the dominant political debate of our times has been absolutely about culture. Immigration looming large within that, powerful sense of who we are and what we are. But that cultural debate that cuts across so many issues has felt larger than the economic debate. On the whole, in politics, for the last, I don't know, 20 years, on the whole, the truth that it's economics stupid that matters has dominated. But things feel a lot more febrile when it's culture that seems to dominate. And it's not clear to me, by the way, whether once we exit the European Union in a few weeks' time, and once we move out of the pandemic stage of dealing with the pandemic into the tough economic waters that clearly we're moving into, do economics come back as an account? It does strike me that if that were to be the case, notwithstanding all the things that we've discussed so far or heard so far, people have to trust Labour on economics. There, you know, this is not to align myself with austerity, but it is to say that it does feel to me that if you look at the Labour governments that we have had, and there haven't been many in the 20th century, which is why I slightly, I mean, you know, yes, we need a leftist account, but the truth is the British people have historically turned to the left rarely in modern history, not a lot in modern, I think it's 22 years in the 20th century. And so these trends, when I think about Attlee, when I think about Blair, when I think about Wilson, they did seem to me to have powerful accounts of the future economy, where the jobs were going to come from and where work could be found, and a sort of Jerusalem type rebuilding Britain was a powerful theme that ran through those three leaders of the Labour Party. I know that Wilson was in tougher, you know, economic waters than both, in some ways, than Blair and Attlee, because I don't think anyone felt that Labour was responsible for the war and the economic damage that had been done to Britain at that time, or indeed the Conservatives. But nevertheless, that we have to have an account of the future, and we have to have an account based, if you like, that comes from our soil, and you know, where people are, and what and a sense that we can deliver for them, which is that we're trusted. I don't particularly want to get into the whole identity politics bit, but clearly, I mean, certainly in my book, whilst I'm not going to depart for standing up for minorities in Britain and having an account of Britain's colonial heritage that gives us some of the issues that remain in this country, I do recognise that the politics of identity cannot be the beginning and end of the story, and certainly can't be the whole account. That it's unlikely that that will be a sufficient thing to garner office, and therefore, you know, colleagues have to be aware and sensitive to that. I'm nervous about any ethnic nationalism. I don't think that leads to a good place, but I do think that you have to be in a civic place, a civic nationalist, or you certainly patriotism is important. I mean, I think people do, the great in Great Britain means something to people, it seems to me. Yesterday, I tweeted about the Human Rights Act, and I suggested rightly in both my article in the Telegraph and in terms of my tweet, that Churchill was absolutely one of the forefathers of the human rights settlement that we have in this country and that we have in Europe. That is a matter of fact. I was surprised then. I received so much abuse from the left, for whom Churchill has clearly become a great bogeyman. And I understand that. I did a documentary for Channel 4 on some of what he got up to in the First World War in relation to Africans who made a contribution to the First World War. I understand the Bengal famine and all those issues, but that surely doesn't mean you can't say that both through the Second World War and after the Second World War, he had a powerful view about human rights that is it's truth. So the point is that it's worrying. It's really worrying that colleagues, almost as a left politician, I couldn't say that for many on the left in order to defend the Human Rights Act, which is today's issue, you know, in our country. So I guess my starting point is belonging and place. The language of devolution isn't sufficient to get us there. We have to have an account of the future that resonates with people and that we're trusted to deliver, which does have an economic salience. And I think we have to be a bit, we have to have a nod to the people, to the British people, that, and not a general assumption that Britain's always turned to socialism, because historically that is not true. And the Labour Party has to be a broad church. And I say this because I grew up poor and black in the 70s and 80s, listening to great socialist teachers in schools and university tell me successively that Michael Foot was going to win in 83, that Kinnock was going to win in 87, and that we were going to win in 1992. And I believed them. And then I come to realize that the folk who were losing out when we lost were people like me, not them, who were liberal, left and middle class. So I came to understand, and I suppose my 7 years in Peterborough also, that we are a very broad church, and we have to come to the country as a broad church in order to win. And then one last point. I've always thought it's slightly odd that there's an assumption that working class people will want to vote necessarily for a working class prime minister, because that's also not historically true and not tends to be what they're presented with in this country. In a way, I accept that Boris Johnson is a quintessentially English figure. There was something that felt quite English to me about Tony Blair at the time in 1997. And so the ingredients that make you offer something to what is the English people, it seems to me, do count for something and matter considerably. It's not solely about class. It's about who you are, who you speak for, how you present yourself. I hope that I'm not, you know, I've not been as careful with my language as I could have been, but I'm trying to speak as freely as possible. Thank you.
We appreciate that, and it's all on the recording, so
yeah, I realise that.
But that was very good, and thank you very much indeed. Now, there's a huge number of themes coming up in the discussion, and I've encouraged people to continue to put questions in. I'm going to try and work from the questions you put in, but it becomes too laborious getting people to unmute and put their camera on and all the rest of it. Let me just pick up, probably for Paula, just to start with, to clear some ground. There's a few questions have come in from John Wilson, Gareth Young and others about the liberal authoritarian scales. And one question is, do those liberal authoritarian values, are they sort of fairly fixed over time, or do they change and evolve how people answer those questions according to the context of current debates? And a related question perhaps is whether we can equate or not equate the authoritarian end of the scale with anti-immigration attitudes.
Thank you. So I should in a longer talk on values, I would set that ground a little bit more, in that we conceive of these values as actually being a kind of enduring part of our political outlook, and they don't change very much over time. They've been stable within the British electorate for quite a long period, and they're stable at the individual level. Largely, some people do change, obviously, but not generally rapidly. And we would be worried, actually, if they did change rapidly when we're conceiving them as measures of values that are supposed to be enduring over time. And so they don't change rapidly. They do connect with particular sets of issues, but you can't straightforwardly equate the values to individual political positions. That actually is what changes with context, is the connection between your values, which is the kind of society that you want to live in, and then the individual political issues that come up of the day. So there's not always necessary connections between particular issues. We see that at the moment, you know, the endless media representations and attempts to connect attitudes to lockdowns and mask wearing and vaccines and everything else to some kind of Brexit divide just doesn't work, because they don't connect in that way at all. So you have to move from the core values, which give you a kind of orientation, a lens, an identity almost for viewing the world, to each individual issue. It's not something that's an automatic read off.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to throw a question now, if I could, to John and to Simon. There are two issues coming up in the chat and on the questions. One picks up very much this sense of place, but also related questions about, should we just be talking about place? Should we be talking about nation as well? So a politics of belonging. And the second theme that is running is about the economics of addressing the political economy of this section of the electorate. Just trying to tease out some senses of, are these two separate exercises that one might try to do, which are about place and devolution, or the idea of the nation, and a political economy debate somewhere else? Or do we in some way need to run the two so that the way we talk about the political economy also talks about the place?
Simon, do you want to do the political economy?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, for me, the overlap. We've talked a little bit about culture, and we've talked a little bit about political economy. But the fundamental issue is as a species, we strive to achieve security. And the sense of the inability to reproduce ourselves economically inspires insecurity that resonates throughout the life course. It spills into human relationships, affects your attitudes towards immigrants, for example, as being threatening. If we can establish a sense of security, that sense of continuity of our employment, the continuity of cultural traditions, not that they stay fixed, but they evolve gradually over time, then this is the key issue that we need to drag out. It's not about how we can create a political economy that integrates all people. Rather, it's about how can we facilitate the sense of security that allows us to get a foothold in reality and create the forms of community that people find nourishing. So for me, the two are intertwined.
Yeah, no, I would agree with what you say there, Simon. And actually, long ago, I wrote a piece about Labour political language in the interwar period, and security was the key thing that they moved to in the later 30s and became a dominant sort of theme. And that idea that you could secure people and their children's lives, especially from the ravages of, obviously in the 30s, mass unemployment. And it got linked into issues about the nation. So when you're talking about how do we see these things connected, because Attlee was very comfortable with making the, security for the people and security for the nation link, just in terms of a play of words. But to answer the place part of the question that you raised there, John, so I totally agree with what Simon says, but I think on the issue of locality or nation, probably the Labour Party really does have to bite the bullet, maybe not immediately, but it has to make clear that if the Scottish people want to be independent, it believes in self-determination and believes in independence. It cannot keep hiding behind the fiction, because Britishness really means almost nothing now, actually. It has a residual meaning because it's a way of evading some of the unattractive ethnic meanings attached to Englishness. But if you're Welsh or you're Scottish, it's pretty meaningless now. So it's a sort of polite way of saying you're English increasingly, because that's the reality of how things have changed in the last 30 years. And so that's got to be grappled somehow. And that means thinking about political solutions that are relevant to England, means not being squeamish about Starmer saying he's English, because actually it's an enormous asset for him that he is in lots of ways, given the cephalogical mountain he has to climb, which is exactly as Paula and David have described it. It isn't just about the northern working class seats. All of them together wouldn't give Labour a majority. It's about North Kent and, you know, the suburban areas around Bristol where I used to live, which are all currently Conservative, but were solidly New Labour. So there's a really complicated challenge. And although I think the route to trying to make a non-toxic Englishness is probably local, I think that there are really bigger issues that the left has to grapple around devolution.
Thank you. If I could follow that last point up, certainly with David and again with Simon, is how important is it that in politics, and I suppose we've ended up talking about Labour politics inevitably here, that people talk explicitly about England? I mean, David will know that last year, for example, the Labour Party was promising to rebuild Wales, rebuild Scotland, and to rebuild Britain. So it was only promising to rebuild Britain in England, and it didn't mention England. So to what extent is it important that the Labour Party becomes at ease with talking about England? How does that work, perhaps with younger voters in big cities who are less likely to identify as English than as British? And can that be done? And to Simon, I suppose the question is, but also to John or Paul if they want to come in talking to the voters that you've talked to who do identify as English, to what extent is talking about Englishness important to forming an identity with them? Or is that in fact a way of expressing their frustration about being excluded in all sorts of ways from what's going on? David, can I go to you first, then Simon, then anybody else who wants to come in?
I think it's very important. There was something that John said that I didn't quite agree with. Britishness has almost died, but it may be that I misunderstood. I think if you were saying, what does Britishness mean if you're in Wales or in Scotland, and that was where you were parking it, then that I can understand. Clearly, here in England, ethnic minorities, I think, do attach themselves to Britishness because it evokes empire and you can be proximate to that Britishness. And I think that cosmopolitan liberal types, whether they're voting Labour or Conservative, also find it quite easy to attach themselves to Britishness. But clearly, Englishness is more of a problem, and clearly it's got to stop being a problem. So I do think it's important to talk about England, but I recognise it's not straightforward, because the other truth, I think, of electoral maths is that it's quite important that Labour makes significant inroads in Scotland, and it may be that if you're banging on and on about England, that's being heard in a slightly different way in Scotland or indeed in Wales. So you're back to the challenge in politics of being able to talk about a number of things all at the same time. So some of this is also about code, and it is about the leader that you have, and that leader's sense of speaking for somewhere and from something, and not being afraid to lean into that thing that you are from and part of. You know, I'm fortunate enough to know Keir Starmer and to get to know Keir Starmer, and he always strikes me, and this is because I've got quite a lot of family that live on the Sussex-Kent border, as someone of Sussex and Kent. I think that that's not a bad thing to be, and you'd probably do quite well to lean into that, because it happens to be a part of England that's, you know, quite significant and important. And I think you can pick up themes there that are significant. When I've knocked on doors in successive elections for 20 years, that the place I always say to my office, you've got to get me up there, is Yorkshire. because I think, you know, a Yorkshire man or woman and what they're saying on the doorstep is the key to winning elections. That's just my thing. So you have to be chiming with those people. You have to be connected to those people, and you have to, they have to look at you and recognize something. And that's what I was getting at when I said that when they looked, much that I didn't like her politics, when they looked at Margaret Thatcher, they recognized something. When they looked at Tony Blair, they recognized something. When they look at Boris Johnson, I mean, I can't stand it personally, but they do recognize, I recognize it. I saw bits of Boris Johnson in the Queen jumping out of a plane in the Olympic ceremony, which for my taste was too much, but went down very well in England. You know, you can't talk about all of these things all at the same time, but the symbols that you set, the priorities you set are very important. I come back actually also to, I think, the English being, generally speaking, as a group, they like a sense of fiscal responsibility with their money. Just think that's my instinct about the English. Certainly the people of Peterborough and Tottenham.
David, thank you. Simon.
Yes, well, I really haven't got much to add other than nation. The idea of nation is one of the few forms of collective identity that is present in everyday life. And I think increasingly we cling on to it in the absence of all of those traditional forms of collective identity, in particular class, which has much, you know, if I'm talking to a class of students, they don't put themselves in the position of class in the way that my generation did and the generation before mine. So I think people are dipping into this as a form of kind of, as a means of rootedness and the absence of other things. And of course, English nationalism, as we move forward, will be informed by our near neighbours and the development of the forms of nationalism that have developed in Wales and Scotland. And we feel, well, I must be English then, and kind of drawing away from the traditional kind of idea of Britain into something more particular is something we're going to see in the years to come. And whether or not the Labour Party can harness that energy remains to be seen, but I'm kind of somehow doubtful at the moment.
Thank you. Please do keep putting some other questions in. I hope that answered a question raised by Lawrence Ellis and a number of other people, but I'll come back to what governments might do in a moment. Just following that through that idea of nation, Paula, I'll let you answer that question, but I just want to put one to you as well. One of the things that you mentioned in your presentation is we don't really have attitudes on welfare in some of these value scales. Something we don't collect regularly is ideas of sovereignty and where sovereignty should lie. But we know that in the European referendum, sovereignty was one of the very big issues reported by voters for voting leave. To what extent does ideas of sovereignty play into the group of voters that we're talking about at the moment? But do pick up that earlier discussion first, if you like, before going on to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up something about that earlier discussion, because understandably, we've talking a lot within the chat and within the panel about Englishness, but an awful lot of the trends that we see in terms of values are almost identical in Wales. So a very large group of, I'll use the shorthand, left authoritarian voters, some areas with very strong support for UKIP and Brexit Party. Brexit Party will still poll 10, 12% in parts of South Wales, even though they're basically inactive. So that's something that I think we have to be careful of putting too much of the weight on Englishness, because it's clearly not Englishness that's driving that in Wales. And actually, people talk about the Red Wall now as if it's something to do with the north of England, but it included a whole bunch of seats in North Wales as well when it was first talked about. So I think that's something we just need to be a little bit wary of and think about. Although these things correlate, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can view everything through this lens of Englishness and it really explain what's going on. I think we just need to be aware of that. The issue of sovereignty, it's really hard because I think you'd have to go into a different mode of research. I think you'd have to follow David's approach of going and talking to people on doorsteps and trying. I don't even know really what voters would have in their minds when you said the word sovereignty to them. I mean, I don't even know that they would really have any meaningful engagement with that. But one thing that I think might play into some of these debates and some of the questions I've seen on the chat is this distinction between different levels of devolution and different levels of identity. So whether we're talking about national and regional identities, for example. I did some analysis of this using British social attitudes data earlier this year sometime. This year's a bit of a blur, if I'm honest. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was about half of all the values groups want the way that England is governed to stay as it is. There's not a huge kind of outpouring of desire for an English Parliament or any other change in arrangement. But amongst the half that do want to see a change, the left liberals lean towards regional assemblies. The left authoritarians lean towards an English Parliament. So there is a different desire for where that idea of belonging and sovereignty might sit, I think, within these different groups. And that, if you start to talk about devolution, has the potential to pull apart your coalition of voters again, because actually they see belonging at very different levels.
Okay, thank you.
There was one thing I wanted to
David,
say one policy area that I explored in my book that may be relevant here, and it was immigration. And there has been, I've had some really good emails and follow up on that, which was I reminded readers that in some parts of Europe, much more of immigration policy is devolved, that there is a much greater scope for different parts of Germany to have a slightly different approach to issues of immigration. And I think this goes back to some of what Simon was saying and John, but perhaps if that were to be a position, it would allow areas of the country to have different views on their local economy and what was required in terms of employment, but different views also about their sense of place. You'd have to do it through national insurance numbers and as people arrive into the country where they're allowed to take their first jobs and where they aren't. But the point is, it's that sense of control and locality, economics and place that somehow come together for people. And I wasn't suggesting it as a Labour platform, but I was putting it into the book so that people can think about it, because it's not actually, people tend to see immigration policy in this country as totally centralised and then forced down, not understanding that there are other countries who do it slightly differently.
Okay, thank you. John, can I come to you with a question from Dan Taylor? Because you might want to have a historical perspective on this. I mean, he says parts of the left have been trying to reclaim patriotism for many decades. He mentions William Morris, George Orwell, through to Billy Bragg and Blue Labour. Where is the evidence that this will actually gain the left any capital? I mean, a different view might be that there were times when the left won when it was seen as an explicitly patriotic party. I mean, do you have a view of how the people in the studies you looked at saw those ideas of patriotism and the left in the past?
Well, I mean, the truth is, in the vernacular, most people aren't very interested in party politics most of the time. And so what I'm looking at is not political research, it's social science research, sociology. So it comes up, pride of nation comes up quite often, but people aren't distinguishing between the political parties very often. There's a little bit of that in the post-Suez material, and that's about it, really. And as I say, that is a very traumatic time for Britain, and in many ways, Wilson navigates that quite skillfully, that sense of national flux, and on the whole presents himself as a solid provincial patriot against the sort of decadent ways of what's happened to the former ruling elite of empire. I mean, essentially all of the Labour politicians who've been successful have allied themselves with a sort of a gentle form of patriotism. It's certainly true for Attlee, it's true for Blair. Okay, things got a bit scary later on, but in '97, that was the aim. So I mean, I don't think the things the figures that are picked out there are obviously not people who are central to political projects, but there's never been someone who is manifestly uncomfortable with nation and patriotism who's successfully taken the Labour Party very far, and there won't be.
Thank you. Question here from John Wilson, following on the localism and devolution theme, perhaps. He says, how do we articulate a link between locality and nation? Isn't there a danger that Labour uses locality as a way to evade the nation, particularly given the dominance of Labour MPs from places where locality is often articulated against the nation, i.e. London more than England or Britain, the North or Yorkshire against the South? Is there a way, come to you, David, perhaps, and then to Simon for a view of, can you balance those two?
You have to. I mean, you can't just disappear into locality, but my starting point, you have to be of somewhere. So some of our most prominent politicians are clearly of somewhere. And I'm sure if you focus group tested that, it'd be very clear. Andy Burnham is riding high. He is of somewhere. Jess Phillips is of somewhere. I am of somewhere, very identified with Tottenham and with London. But we have to be a team of people. So it's got to be more than just some of the names that you're hearing. So I think you can be, particularly in a changing economy, surely in a recession, surely where high streets are going to come under such tremendous strain as some of retail does not come back. Surely where you've got areas of the country where there are offices that will not come back in the same way, because why would you have 5 floors of an office block when you could have 1 and everyone else is on Zoom? Surely in that context, you would thought that you've got to be in a place that is where people are locally. But at the same time, because I suspect we're into a very tough decade, we have to have an account that's of the nation. I'm not going to, it's not for me to start pontificating of where Scotland will end up in this. It's not my expertise, but clearly we have to have an account of England, and a pretty powerful one. At the same time, I would have thought.
Simon.
Yes, I agree. I think what we need is a kind of a story of us together, and our interests and our history. And this is where the left can make a lot of capital, I'm sure of it.
Good.
You can talk to people and their personal experience. Sorry, go for it.
Sorry, and my broadband was causing me problems.
Need a story of us, so
yeah.
Sorry.
John.
Yes. I think.
Carry on, Simon. Carry on.
I was just about to say, one of the great things now, this particular moment when we're decoupling from the European Union, we can create a positive story about a shared England and our economy and what we're going to build here in the future that is going to be better than what currently exists. And this is what's been missing, a story of something different and positive to look forward to. Not the present devoid of some negative characteristics we don't like much, but something that is different that we can commit to. And I think this is one of the great absences of the Labour Party throughout the neoliberal era, accepting the kind of austerity and all, Thatcher winning on the economy and all the rest of that. It needs a new model.
Well, actually, I would just dispute that, Simon. I just dispute that slightly. Only slightly though. My sense was in 1997. I don't know if John agrees with this, that Labour had a powerful account of the nation. It was largely Britishness because it had a powerful account of rebuilding public services at a point where people were just had enough with schools with leaky roofs and hospitals that didn't work and all the rest of it. So it did give us a kind of account of the nation that people wanted to latch onto and trusted us to deliver it. And we knew mechanisms, whatever you thought of it, like PFI and others, of then delivering it in what people thought at the time might be a fiscally responsible way. So I think that now, I'm not sure that was all neoliberal. I think some of that was deeply cultural. People felt they deserved a better school than their kids were going to. They deserved, not to have to wait for years in A&E and we had a really, and in many ways, in parts of the country where public services were run down, people also got employment. Now we have to be in the business at the moment. I mean, I see this, those who are self-employed, people talk about the white van man, but that whole community of people who also work in the private have to come back to Labour in a very serious way. And we have to be in the business of, particularly on leaving the European Union, of wealth creation, of not just being a public service party, but also where does the money come from? How do you create something? And how is Labour on the side of those people that do that work?
Okay. John, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in very quickly on what Simon was saying, and I think it coincides with what David's saying as well there, which is that I was really struck in the historical testimony that down to the 60s, there's a very powerful sense that there's no tension between personal and family, well, the phrase of the time was betterment, and collective improvement in social conditions. And people see themselves in a shared journey of progress and improving conditions. And the job of politics is to construct, firstly, the belief that that's possible and you can deliver it. And obviously, more importantly, to do so, because unless you do so, the narrative breaks down very, very quickly. So you need that vision. And so the politics that Simon's talking about of us, the idea of the politics of pronouns are always important. And the book was called Me, Me, Me for a reason. And the idea is that you have to realize that it's much more, the politics even now is much more complicated than that. And it could be us, us, us. You've got to construct it. And that's the job.
As David cheekily asked me a question, because I meant to be asking the questions, and my view of 97 was that there was a very compelling national story. And I've always jibbed slightly the idea that everybody bought into neoliberalism. I think the reality was there was hugely over-optimistic view about how quite limited tools like the minimum wage and skills training and regional investment could address the problems of economic inequality that were being produced all the time by a globalized economy. And it was that belief that much more could be done than could be was the problem. I'm just going to say, John Wilson and Sri Kandia have both said they want to ask questions. I'm not bringing people into the conversation because it never works properly technically, but if both of them would like to quickly scribble down a new question, I promise to ask it. Can I throw out, though, quite a challenging one, which we may or may not have skirted around, to give the people that Simon has been talking about a voice, then they need to have their views, which includes views like real worries about immigration, expressed as part of the national debate. And how does that fit with those parts of our society for whom those views are offensive or challenging or very uncomfortable or make people feel that they are being rejected? And how do we negotiate a discussion in which people with quite contrasting views about what society should be like can be, how do we negotiate that discussion so that it works and produces the unifying story rather than the divisive story? So can I put that either to David or Simon first?
Well, look, I think that I listen to many people, friends in Peterborough, that had different views to me instinctively on immigration. And I tried to listen, and I wrote about it in the book from a position that wasn't one of judgment, but was one of listening. And I suppose instinctively, as a lawyer or someone that's legally trained, it is quite important that we as a country and as a nation are in the business of the forums for different perspectives on these very different, you know, on challenging subjects like immigration. So it can't be just you're off with your view here, and it's how, you know, in any country in the world that's worth anything, you are able to settle differences of opinion for a period, arrive at a slightly different place. Now, as I said in the book, I wanted to at least reveal the way other countries have done that, and they've done it with a slightly more federal model than the one that we have, that does at least allow people to have a degree of local determination about change in their communities, and particularly where economically jobs are scarce or the local economy feels to be in a problematic way, to allow people to say, well, you know, we want to prioritize certain kinds of people in the employment market in this area. And so that was the way I addressed that subject in my book, at least, before coming into government. Look, I am, no, everyone knows this, I'm deeply worried about the growing ethnic nationalism. I'm deeply worrying about, I think, traditions that have always been very present in the country, as John demonstrated in his initial contribution. Those traditions moving from what felt fringe into the mainstream. And I think there have been different points in our modern history where those views have felt way more mainstream. And that worries me, because you see, what I see in our country is a country, like many others, grappling with some really big issues: an aging population, globalization, technology, AI, inequality, pensions crisis, big issues. And then too many politicians that reduce those issues to being about immigration or Iqbal that moved in down the road. And the problem with that politics is, I'm afraid, it ends badly empirically, because it's not true. It's not a sufficient prescription for the problems that people see in front of them. So that road, I don't think, ends in a great place historically on the whole. However, what one can't do is run from people's feelings about their sense of self and place. You have to create a society in which people can negotiate and arbitrate with that, and which people can test things or go in a particular direction. It seems to me that's my instinct, and that's, you know, as far as I felt I could go in exploring that in my book. But these are questions that obviously any government would have to settle. Although I do note, when you look, that we ought to keep in hand one social attitude surveys which do suggest that people, for example, are far more willing than they were 20, 30 years ago for their, you know, this is a white Englishman, for their daughter to marry a black guy or an Asian guy. The figures are all going, and in fact, the biggest growing ethnic group are those of mixed heritage, despite all the doom and gloom. And I always think love is a good indication of how people are actually feeling about these things. And actually also, we've seen that certainly since the Brexit decision, immigration is falling as an issue that people are prioritising. It's not there in the top 5 issues people are raising, and it's not coming up on the doorstep in the same way. So we've also got to be a little bit how politicians choose to amplify these issues. Priti Patel being a good example of that at the moment, you know, is really important and very interesting.
Simon.
Yes, I think just one of the perhaps more startling conclusions of the book on the rise of English nationalism and the far right is that their principal object of hatred was not the recently arrived immigrant. There was plenty of hatred to go around, but the number one enemy was the kind of metropolitan liberal who believes that all of their anxieties about their life and their heritage and their jobs is rooted in some kind of racism or some kind of bigotry in some way, that it's backwards looking and it's negative. And of course, when you go out to these places and you talk to these people, they identify local issues. They talk about things that are affecting them directly, the loss of institutions and things like that. And I think one of the things that the left must do to reclaim some capital in this arena is to acknowledge the anxieties of ordinary people who in many cases might not be racist or not imagine themselves to be racist, and yet still have grave anxieties about the speed of change and how it is affecting their world. So I think, of course, there are problems with, I know in the Labour Party now, there's a movement towards opening borders, which very practically creates all kinds of issues for the left to create a new political economy of nation. But these issues need to be, well, how to pitch it. We need to be respectful of people's personal experience. And if we are to challenge what we believe to be bigotry, it has to be direct and informed and not uniform and blanket. All of these people are racist. It has to be nuanced. We have to carry these people with us. If we simply dismiss them as being Neanderthal racists, then we've lost them. The correct thing for the left to do is to bring these people towards a progressive politics, rather than simply to kind of daub them in the colours of absolute evil.
Thank you, Simon. Paula, we're actually nearly up to time, and I was going to invite David to respond overall. I don't know if you want to add anything to what you just said, David, you left on a pretty high note there, but I'll bring you back at the very end. But does John, Paula, anything else you would like to add to the discussion?
Well, I think just that last point, really. I mean, it seems to me, and it's in David's example about tweeting about Churchill, that one of the obvious traps that Johnson will lay are culture war traps for the left before the next election. And the fact that we're trying ourselves to dig more traps, and, you know, in other words, that the left is so determined to police these issues is a massive problem, because really we have to shrug our shoulders and say it's Trumpism, it's a deliberate culture trap. What matters is, you know, and bring the debate to concrete issues. Whereas at the moment, large swathes of left liberal opinion are as wrapped up in any of these issues as their foes. And I think it's going to play to Johnson. And that, you know, I was looking at all of the reactions to Starmer's hinting that he might call for an abstention, and the performance of the outrage of the liberal left is, you know, it's just bonkers if you want to win an election.
Paula.
So yeah, I very much agree with that sentiment, but I think it's really important that conversations aren't shut down, even where they are uncomfortable for people to hear. Because if we think about our own personal lives, if we think about the advice we get as parents, the advice is always to have those difficult conversations with people, not to sweep the issues under the carpet and ignore them and hope that our children don't take the wrong paths or take paths we wouldn't want them to take. The advice is to have the conversations openly. And I think that's really important here as well. I think that sense actually that opinions aren't valued was one of the driving forces behind the disconnection of these groups of voters from politics, not just from the Labour Party, but from politics as a whole. To see in the data for 97, where we spent weeks talking about a youthquake that may or may not have happened, actually older voters with these kinds of values that we're talking about turning away from politics was really quite shocking. And I think we have to have those conversations. We can't keep trying to shut debate down if we're going to reconnect with those voters on any meaningful level.
Thank you. David.
Look, I think I think we've covered quite a lot, so I haven't got that much more to add, really, except I defend my right to tweet positively about Churchill as well as to have a critique. And I don't think Labour's winning if politicians like me don't think that, to be honest.
I agree.
Thank you, David. Can I thank all the panelists and all the people who've stuck with us for a very long time through this discussion. As I said at the beginning, what I hope we could do is by throwing different perspectives at a group of people would have a more rounded discussion. And I think actually we have, because we've covered a lot about people's fundamental values and the way they see their world. We've also learned a lot about the actual language with which people talk about themselves and their identity and their view of the world. We've explored how those values and what they want relates to the sort of economy that they live in and the opportunity of there being a different type of economy. And I think I've come away with a lot of confidence that actually we can have these conversations that make it possible to tell a national story about England and to govern England in a different way and to develop a politics of place that matters to people and which relates to them. And I think that my hope in the seminar was we would show that if we bring the different perspectives together, you get that rich outcome. And I'm incredibly grateful to the 4 speakers for their lead-offs and their contributions. And I hope that people who've been in this discussion will come back to future events at the centre. The next one, by the way, is on the 22nd of January with Carwyn Jones, the former First Minister of Wales, looking once more at relations within the Union. But for today, thank you very much indeed. We will be posting the recording on the website in due course. Thank you.